Joni Lamb's marriage collapsed overnight, and her entire life collapsed as a terrible secret was revealed. Everyone was startled when what appeared to be a beautiful marriage fell apart due to hidden realities. They kept everything under wraps, lied, and deceived. This was no ordinary tale. This startling news was the buzz of Joni's world. What actually took place? How had it affected everything? You will be shocked to learn what was kept so long a secret. For a long time, Joni Lamb's marriage to Doug Weiss appeared to be the epitome of a second-chance romance. After her husband Marcus Lamb passed away unexpectedly and tragically, many people believed Joni would never find another spouse who could provide her with the same kind of support that Marcus had. However, there was optimism and a kind of regeneration when Doug arrived. He was viewed as the ideal candidate to assist Joni in continuing Daystar's legacy and advancing in her personal life. He was an established and esteemed Christian therapist. From the outside, everything appeared fantastic. They made the ideal Christian couple. They were usually spotted holding hands and encouraging one another at religious functions. They provided followers hope that love may return after grief by portraying a caring, supportive partnership. Joni, who has always been the resolute and powerful leader, appeared to be at peace with Doug by her side. He looked to blend very well with her and was calm and collected. Over time, however, things began to shift. The flawless facade that Joni and Doug had presented to the world was not without flaws. People gradually realized that Doug was no longer attending as many gatherings with Joni as he formerly did. This was no little issue. Withdrawing from the center made it obvious what was happening. When they did appear together, it was different. In a way they had never experienced before, they felt strange and frigid near one another. Their warm smiles that once conveyed love now seemed forced, as if they were trying too hard to make everything appear normal. Supporters who enjoyed the couple's relationship started to notice the changes. Doug's attendance in church and service events decreased. Together, they intended to stand, but they had lost the spark that had once existed between them. Their body language said a lot, and they smiled, but their eyes did not meet their grins. Nobody knew what was wrong, but it was obvious that something was amiss. At first, many convinced themselves it was just a difficult time. Every marriage has its ups and downs, don't you think? But the tension between Doug and Joni was too much for these two to overlook. There was a distinct mental and physical distance between them. The concept of a perfect Christian connection between them vanished, as did the joy they formerly shared. They couldn't seem to stop what they had put so much effort into creating in public from evaporating. Things were even more difficult to comprehend. After years of assisting other couples in resolving their issues, Doug was under a lot of stress now that he was married to Joni Lamb. This was no ordinary marriage. She was married to him and the head of one of the world's most significant Christian networks. Every action Doug took was observed, and every word he said was examined. He felt exhausted by the attention and tension he wasn't used to. Doug was accustomed to offering advice and assisting others with their issues. But the expectations were too high now that he was in the public eye. People admired him and believed he would make a wonderful spouse. He felt pressured to constantly live up to the ideal Christian guy. And that picture began to drag him down over time. It is one thing to wish to assist others. But it's another matter entirely if your own life is collapsing. Joni also had her own burden to bear. After Marcus passed away, she assumed responsibility for managing Daystar, continuing the ministry's mission, and remaining resilient for everyone in her vicinity. She struggled to balance her responsibilities as the head of a sizable Christian network with her personal life. Nor was it simple. Her life became much more complex as Doug's distance increased. The church was no longer the only focus. It was about her ability to keep everything from falling apart, her marriage, and her own happiness. The stress on both sides was beginning to strain their relationship. Joni wanted Daystar to stay focused on the strategy she and Marcus had laboriously developed. Doug, however, believed that a different approach should be taken. Initial differences turned into more significant issues. Their disagreements over how to manage their personal lives, their relationship, and the church's destiny caused friction. What had been a scene of tranquility was now becoming a battlefield. It wasn't simply about maintaining appearances anymore. The actual battle was being fought behind closed doors. The couple's close acquaintances also began to sense the stress. The holes were now visible to those who had previously been in awe of their connectedness. Their relationship seemed to be deteriorating daily, and topics that were once simple to discuss were contentious. They were becoming less and less talkative, and the pressure to maintain a flawless image became too much for them to bear. It felt more and more like a mask because of the things they didn't speak to each other, despite the public perception of a happy, loving marriage. Despite always being the strong leader, Joni was increasingly in difficulty. She was accustomed to protecting Daystar's reputation and ensuring that everything appeared flawless for everyone to see. However, her personal life was becoming unmanageable, and she was at a loss for what to do. As she and Doug spent more time together, the questions increased. She needed to ask tough questions and be honest with herself. Had she fallen into a trap, or was this marriage truly a fresh start for her? Joni put a lot of effort into making her marriage seem perfect, but those around her questioned whether it was all real. When the doors were closed, what was happening inside their home? Was the flawless image they presented to the public a figment of their imagination? Or had they simply outlived their ability to hold everything together? Every day, the meticulously constructed image began to unravel, leading everyone to speculate about the true nature of Joni and Doug's relationship. There was more to the harm done to their previously flawless image than a simple alteration in appearance. It marked the beginning of a difficult journey that would permanently alter their lives. The public perception of Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss's marriage was not all that there was to it. Although there was a lot of turmoil going on behind the scenes, fans liked how their relationship appeared to be based on faith, second chances, and supporting one another. They weren't merely attempting to maintain their public image. It was about their intense personal conflict, which none of them anticipated when they were married. Once a well-respected Christian psychotherapist, Doug Weiss was suddenly forced into a position of prominence he had never experienced before. For years, he had been providing knowledgeable and compassionate guidance to other couples, helping them resolve their issues. However, he suddenly made headlines as Joni Lamb's spouse rather than as a psychotherapist. That type of pressure was completely different. He was no longer merely offering advice to others. They were testing him now. Every action and statement he made was observed and heard by the people. Being the focus of attention had never appealed to Doug. He preferred to assist others in the background, out of view. But now it was his turn to leave. It was too much for someone who used to assist others in their marriages to deal with being a public figure. Longtime acquaintances believed he would be a wonderful husband, someone who would support Joni and advance Daystar. He started to feel burdened by the numerous high expectations he had to meet. In solitude, he felt compelled to live up to that image. He was a well-known professional in the past for his work as a marriage counselor. Now, however, he was constantly being observed. He needed to be the best husband, the best Christian guy, and the best partner. He was discussing more than simply his professional life. Every aspect of his private life was being scrutinized, evaluated, and researched. That kind of stress hurts a lot, and Doug began to experience it in unexpected ways. However, Joni had her own issues to contend with. She had to manage Daystar while coping with her grief and the death of her cherished spouse after Marcus passed away unexpectedly. She had to continue Daystar without him after he helped her establish it. To finish this enormous task, she needed to exert all of her power and energy. She needed to figure out how to manage her personal and professional lives now that Doug was involved. Nor was it simple. She believed that her marriage to Doug would improve her situation, but it instead seemed to worsen it. Dealing with Marcus's history and the responsibility of leading Daystar forward was already difficult for her. Things were made worse by having a troubled husband. Being a strong lady, Joni had always been able to handle any situation. But the stress was starting to get to her when no one was around. She was beginning to feel the strain of maintaining a massive media empire, supporting her family, and projecting a calm and powerful image to the world. She loved Doug, but it was becoming obvious that they didn't agree on how to manage the church and their personal lives. Joni was determined to maintain Daystar's ties to the foundation she and Marcus had established, despite Doug's opinions about how things ought to be done. In many respects, they disagreed. Two important things they need to understand are how to manage their personal and professional lives and what to do with the church. These disputes became more significant over time, despite their initial lack of significance. The ministry was only one aspect of it. It was about their marriage and their relationship. Joni was unsure of how to bridge the distance between her and Doug as he began to distance himself. The things they used to agree on appeared to make them fight even more, and they fought more frequently. Doug was going to make things different, but Joni was adamant about preserving what she and Marcus had worked so hard to create. They had discussed a dream, and she didn't want to abandon it. She had more in mind than simply keeping Daystar afloat. The purpose was to honor Marcus's life and contributions. However, Doug appeared to be struggling with all of the demands placed on him, and his rage began to manifest in their marriage. They attempted to appear as though they were all on the same side in public. They clasped hands, grinned, and spoke about their love and faith in Daystar at gatherings. However, things were drastically different when they weren't together. The warmth and affection they once shared now felt forced. The tension between them was unavoidable. They looked away from one another and spoke carefully when discussing their marriage. Their smiles for the photographs appeared to be more like trickery than expressions of affection. Those who had previously respected their partnership began to realize that something was wrong. However, neither Doug nor Joni mentioned the true situation. They didn't discuss their issues since they didn't want to show off their filthy garments in public. The silence made everything worse. Their marriage began to deteriorate the more they attempted to maintain a positive facade. Their home was a place of great stress. Joni would occasionally gaze at Doug and question whether they would ever be able to resume their previous level of love and collaboration. She had put a lot of effort into preserving Daystar's heritage and reputation. She was now struggling to keep her own marriage intact. Joni didn't sure how to approach Doug because he was avoiding people. She didn't know how to make it better. This was the most difficult challenge she had ever had to tackle in her lifetime of assisting others with their problems. She had no one to turn to for support and was unable to figure out how to improve her marriage. They could both sense the tension rising. Although Doug had always been confident in himself, he was suddenly unsure about his ability to meet expectations. Even though Joni had always been the strong one, she was now burdened by her weakness. Their marriage, which had once been a symbol of hope and second chances, was becoming worse. Each day they were growing increasingly irate with one another. The tension had been mounting for months before it finally gave out. Joni and Doug could no longer pretend that their marriage was wonderful. There was no turning back from the fissures that had previously existed. Their internal conflicts, which they had attempted to conceal from others, were visible to all. Both of them were unable to cope with the strain of attempting to maintain their marriage. It was a dreadful fact for both of them. Doug had dedicated his professional life to assisting others in resolving their marital problems, but he was now struggling with his own. The strong and resolute leader, Joni, had to make the most difficult decision of her life. How to maintain Daystar's strength and unity while managing a failing marriage. The destiny of the ministry was influenced by their personal issues. Furthermore, things were made more challenging by having that much power. They were experiencing marital problems in the background. They had put a lot of effort into establishing a solid reputation, but it was gradually disappearing. But behind closed doors, Joni and Doug had to confront the harsh reality. Their relationship had changed from what it had been. The amount of distance, stress, and strain. They were unable to ignore it any longer. They needed to confront the reality of their marriage. The struggle to maintain the ideal image was over. The church was no longer the only focus. They talked about how much they trusted and loved one another, and how heartbreaking it is to know that even the finest relationships might end. When Joni Lamb and Doug Weiss broke up, everyone was astonished. Nor was it merely the dissolution of a marriage. It was the conclusion of a meticulously constructed tale. The public believed that Joni and Doug were a wonderful couple. Their tale of love was a beacon of hope and a second opportunity. In the wake of Joni's husband Marcus's unexpected passing, many had witnessed the development of their relationship and enjoyed their on-stage collaboration. What a tale! It restored my confidence and faith in love, demonstrating that even in the wake of a devastating loss, it may be a new beginning. For many years, Joni and Doug's love was yearned for and admired by many. After Marcus passed away, Joni took over as the spokesperson for Daystar, the church she and Marcus had constructed. As Joni took on the enormous burden of managing the ministry, Doug, a well-known and renowned Christian psychologist, stepped in to assist her. They appeared to be stable, devout, and considerate of one another when they were spotted in public, which was typically during ministry meetings and church functions. Their comments were usually upbeat, their smiles were welcoming, and they always seemed to be in control. However, there were internal fissures that became more noticeable over time and were more difficult to conceal. Despite his constant presence at gatherings, Doug began to miss them. He and Joni were obviously at odds when he eventually arrived. The affection that had been so obvious between them had vanished. Their former supporters began to notice their changes. They spoke in a forced manner, as if they were attempting to maintain a facade that didn't reflect their genuine selves. Their smiles had lost their warmth and had taken on an unmistakable coldness. It was obvious that something was wrong. Those who formerly cherished their flawless image began to question what was actually happening behind the scenes. Initially, many attempted to assume that Joni and Doug were no different than any other couple experiencing hardship. But as time passed, tensions increased. Doug didn't simply overlook stuff. It was immediately apparent that they had lost their spark when he arrived. The grins were fixed. They were measured words. A lot of people wanted to know what had happened to the close relationship they had witnessed between Joni and Doug. Going out in public was no longer the only goal. It was the reality that a relationship was gradually deteriorating. Although Joni had always been strong, she was struggling with her private life, which she had attempted to conceal. Between managing Daystar and attempting to continue Marcus's work, she already had a lot on her plate. However, she was also coping with a failing marriage. Her emotions could no longer support her purpose, her family, and her public persona. Though he was currently dealing with his own issues, Doug had always been the one who kept things stable. Additionally, attempting to live up to the expectations of others was too much for him to bear. He was under a lot of stress from living in the spotlight and trying to be the ideal husband to Joni. It was no longer solely about love. It was about living as though everyone was observing and judging everything you did. As the situation between Joni and Doug worsened, more reports surfaced. Rumors started to spread like wildfire as fans started discussing how their relationship was deteriorating. Some believed that Doug might be concealing something, while others believed that the pressures of fame had worn him down. In actuality, nobody was aware of what was happening behind closed doors. However, they were aware that the couple they formerly looked up to and believed to be so resilient was now dealing with a problem that they were unable to resolve. The truth that their marriage was failing could no longer be concealed. Everyone would soon know. People who had been following Joni and Doug's tale felt as though everything had changed when they learned that they were divorcing. For a long time, they were the epitome of strength, a couple who had endured a lot together and created something lovely. Their marriage appeared to be evidence of the power of faith and second chances. However, that image was now damaged. The divorce was the end of their marriage, but it wasn't the only thing. The idealized image of them that people had created came to an end. Fans were left to speculate about what transpired. People assumed that Joni and Doug were in love because they believed the story. They now had to face the harsh reality that things weren't as they had assumed. Everyone now had something to say about Joni, who had always been seen as strong and resolute in her religion. Many people wanted to know what went wrong, why the marriage ended, and what Joni might have overlooked. The fact that everyone was staring at her added to the pressure she was already feeling. She had always taken care to preserve Daystar's reputation and name. However, it was now her terrible task to defend her private life in public. Additionally, Doug's divorce damaged his reputation. This man assisted other couples in resolving their issues many years ago. He was now being asked about such issues. This man was well known for helping people in relationships, but he was currently going through a highly public divorce. How a marriage counselor could have a failed marriage himself baffled people. Doug had to cope with the consequences of his private life become public, and it was difficult to ignore the humor. As word got out, it became evident that Doug and Joni were now dealing with the consequences of living in the public eye. However, it affected more than one individual. The same was true for Daystar. People believed in Joni and Doug, and their union was interpreted as a show of faith and fortitude. People were questioning whether the image they had displayed was authentic now that the sign had been removed. Joni was under more scrutiny than ever as the leader of Daystar. She had always been viewed as Marcus's successor and the face of the ministry. But suddenly, all she had worked for was in danger of being overshadowed by inquiries about her personal life. Supporters started to question if Doug had simply lied to Joni, whether she had been overly trusting, or whether she had overlooked warning flags. The breakup was no longer the only issue. It had to do with how the invented tale about them suddenly appeared to be untrue. Many were taken aback upon learning about the breakup. For many who had been following Joni and Doug's journey, it seemed like the end of something they held dear. After Marcus's passing, the pair had offered optimism, but now they served as a reminder of how brittle even the strongest relationships can be. They were now displaying the unpleasant reality of a broken marriage after previously presenting an image of bliss. Joni's decision to file for divorce from Doug wasn't made lightly. She made an effort, but ultimately she had to prioritize her health and well-being over looking nice. The flaws were too deep to repair, and the situation was too stressed. For Joni Lamb, this was more than just the dissolution of a marriage. They were no longer seen in public. A tale that captivated millions of people. Fans who had believed that Joni and Doug were a great couple had to face the reality of what had transpired. Unfortunately, it was a harsh lesson. No matter how tough they appear, everyone has difficulties they can't disguise. The ideal was shattered, and the truth about Joni and Doug's marriage was far more challenging than anyone had anticipated.